So thanks everyone for joining. I'm here to present some results from a field experiment on intergroup contact and social cohesion in post-ISIS Iraq. So first, let me start by taking you back to the summer of 2014, where a lot of us were really horrified to see ISIS take over large swaths of territory in northern Iraq and Syria. Part of that campaign involved the ethnic cleansing of religious minorities, primarily Yazidis, but also smaller numbers of Christian and Muslim groups as well, who were hundreds of thousands of whom were forcibly displaced overnight from the orange area you see on the map into the relative safety of the green Kurdish-held area. Most Christians, which is the community I've been working with, thought that they would be home within a couple of days. One mom that I spoke to packed enough clothes for her sons for the weekend, but it was actually 3 to 4 years before they would be able to return. And when they did return, this is what they found. They found that their homes, their businesses, their schools, their churches had been all but destroyed. Everything valuable was taken. So this is a picture I took on the left of a house in the Christian town of Karakush, where you can see in the top left corner, like the AC was pried off the wall, and there's the beginnings of a tunnel that an ISIS fighter had begun to dug in the floor there. In the picture next to it is another house from the same town where it had ISIS graffiti that says, "The Islamic State will live on." And maybe naively, I asked the people who live in this house, why won't you just paint over that? And it was very naive because they obviously could easily do that, but they don't want to. They want to preserve this as a testament to everyone who comes through the town of what happened to them. So this has really become a part of the Christian communal identity, as it has with other groups who were persecuted by ISIS. So it's really hardened those intragroup lines. It's sowed distrust and increased social segregation. And it's increased support for local self-defense militias and even reprisal killings as well. So this is not just the fighting's over, everything is fine now. It's very much a part of people's lived daily reality. So why does low social cohesion matter? So it's actually negatively correlated with a lot of things that we think matter, not just for its own sake, even though that would be enough. So firstly, low social cohesion has been found to have this causal effect on support for authoritarianism. It increases the chances of future violence. And you get this cycle of polarization and social segregation, and then people don't really have chances to meaningfully interact, which makes the chance of future conflict more likely. That future conflict again undermines distrust, and you end up in this social trap of having low social cohesion, low trust, higher chance of future violence, and underdevelopment. And so to illustrate this relationship just correlationally between violence and social segregation, here's a map of Baghdad from the height of the Iraq War. So you can see in 2005, it was actually a pretty mixed city in terms of Sunni and Shia areas, which is the kind of greenish color. And those red dots are areas that had particularly lethal bombings. You fast forward 2 years, and the residents of the city have basically sorted themselves into Sunni and Shia enclaves. So this is a very real phenomenon, and it makes future intergroup contact less likely and less likely to be positive. So we know that this is a problem, this kind of social trap, but what do we know about how to get out of it? So for more than a century, researchers have tried to figure out what is the root cause of prejudice and what can be done to reduce it. So we have a set of different policy tools that we have at the institutional level. We have things like power sharing arrangements, community-driven development. And then at the grassroots level, we have programs that aim to improve the everyday interactions between individuals and really focus on prejudice. And so from that bucket, the contact hypothesis really stands out in psychology. This idea that positive, cooperative contact where people have an equal status within the intervention, even if they don't in society, that kind of positive contact is going to reduce prejudice and form friendships and on the whole improve intergroup relations. Now, on the whole, the causal evidence base for intergroup contact generally seems positive, but we still have a lot of questions that remain open. So first, we don't really know the effects of contact on real world behaviors. So most studies of prejudice focus on survey measures that are measured just before and after the intervention. But the bigger problem is not just the self-reporting of outcomes, it's that there's a difference between how we act toward people who we've met in an intervention and how we act towards strangers from that group when we go back out into the world weeks and months and years after that intervention has ended. And the contact hypothesis relies on this assumption that any positive feeling toward people I've met in this program is going to extend to everyone from that group. And if that assumption is not true, this generalization assumption, then the theory, might just be trivial, or at least have very much lower impact than we would want. So we need to actually start measuring not only real world behaviors, but distinguish between behaviors toward people who we personally know and people out in the world that have nothing to do with the intervention. We also don't really know how contact would operate in a conflict or post-conflict setting, and the evidence that we do have is much more mixed from these settings. And my study doesn't touch on this, but there's not that much evidence on what type of contact matters. So we have one really good causal study that shows that cooperation is much better than competition. But other than that, those conditions that I laid out have not really been systematically tested. So to preview the study, the main research question is, can intergroup contact build tolerance and trust between Christians and Muslims after war? To do this, I've held the type of contact constant. So I tried to make contact as great as possible, like as optimal as possible, and see if it can actually change real world behaviors in a post-conflict setting. And to preview the main result, I found that contact did improve everyday behaviors toward people who met each other in the intervention, but it didn't actually extend off the field and build broader social cohesion. So that generalization assumption in this study, I didn't find that it held. So to talk a bit about the research design, so the aim of the study was to build Christian tolerance toward Muslims. This might seem a little bit backwards if you're familiar with the Middle East, but the areas I was working in happened to be Christian majority areas, and everyone in the study was displaced by ISIS. So we're dealing only with displaced and persecuted communities and trying to build tolerance within that setting. I worked with a local Christian NGO, and what we did was we invited all of the existing soccer teams to join a new set of leagues that we were setting up. We ended up with 42 Christian soccer teams, so they're pretty much ethnically segregated, like much of life in this area. And I then block randomized at the team level whether the team was going to be assigned to the treatment or the control. The treatment group received an additional 3 or 4 Christian players. The control group received an additional 3 or 4 Muslim players. And the block randomization was based on the team average survey response to a question about empathy toward Muslims. So these teams then competed across 4 different leagues and 2 different study sites for a 2-month competition. And I should say that these added players, like they were free agents, or they were drawn from teams that didn't participate, but they were very similar on skill. So that was very important, and we have good baseline balance on skill. And so who are these participants? So the average player was 23 years old, a man. So these were all male leagues. And in terms of their social ties, they had few to no Muslim friends, would not want a Muslim neighbor, and are actually less tolerant than the general population of displaced Christians. So I surveyed more than 1,000 displaced Christians, and the guys in the study were actually less likely to believe in coexistence, more likely to believe in having arms and things like that. So how do we actually know if this works, and how can we differentiate between trust and tolerance toward people who you know versus don't know? So I divide these outcomes into on the field and off the field behaviors. In terms of on the field behaviors, this captures trust and tolerance toward people who you've met on your team or in the league environment. I look at whether you sign up to play in a mixed team next season, whether you vote for a Muslim player who's not on your team, you're not allowed to vote for someone on your team, to receive a sportsmanship award, and whether you're training with Muslim players 6 months after the intervention ends. And then moving to trust toward Muslim strangers, I look at whether you attend a mixed social event 3 months after the league's end. This was an event that we held, kind of like a dinner and dancing thing that was open to the entire neighborhood. So people are faced with the prospect of socializing with Muslims who they don't know. And for one of the leagues, this actually coincided with the iftar, the Ramadan fast-breaking meal. So it was very salient that Muslims would be there. I also look at whether you patronize a business in a Muslim-dominant part of town. So in this case, that's the city of Mosul, which was the ISIS capital of Iraq. It's associated as, this kind of Islamist hotbed, has this kind of connotation, and most Christians haven't been back there, even since the occupation has been over, even though it's one of the 2 big cities next to the town. So we teamed up with this business, this Muslim-owned business in Mosul, and we had this voucher system. So every player got a voucher that was valid for 4 months after the league's end, and it has their unique ID on it. And so if they go, then the owner of the restaurant saves the vouchers, and then we collect them 4 months later, and we see who actually went. And then lastly, I look at whether you donate your survey compensation to a neutral NGO, so an NGO that deals with water sanitation or medical needs of everyone in the area, versus a Christian-only beneficiary NGO like the church. I also look at some attitudes as well. So we do a pre and post survey, and I ended up with 8 outcomes of interest, and I collapsed them into these indices. The first index I call national unity. So agreeing with things like it's arbitrary to divide Iraqis along ethnic and religious lines. We should treat each other as Iraqis first. The second index I call Muslim blame. So do you agree that Muslim civilians were the cause of Christian suffering? And are you okay with these various Muslim groups as your neighbor? So the first one is kind of abstract coexistence ideas, and the other 2 are how you feel about Muslims in particular. And so to jump right into the main results, so I'll start with this left panel. This just shows you the covariate adjusted means for the treatment in the control group. The control group is in purple and the treatment group is in green. And you can see the difference between those means on the right panel. Those are the treatment effects. So first I'll start with the top left panel, so the on the field outcomes. So Christians assigned to mixed teams were about 50 percentage points more likely to be training with Muslims 6 months later, usually ones they met within the league. They are about 23 percentage points more likely to vote for a Muslim not on their team to receive an award. And they are about 12 percentage points more likely to sign up for a mixed team next season. Moving to the off the field outcomes, these effect sizes are much smaller and not distinguishable from 0, at least with this sample size. So you're not distinguishably more likely to visit the restaurant in Mosul, or to attend the mixed social event, or to donate your survey compensation to the mixed NGO. And these standard errors are clustered at the team level, I should say. So what we see is that it was generally much easier to move the on the field outcomes, and the off the field outcomes effect sizes are very different. And in terms of the attitudinal results, I don't show them here, but I see like a 0.5-ish standard deviation increase in this abstract national unity index, but no change to the other 2 indices that capture trust toward Muslims in particular. So when you put all this evidence together, it really seems like, so we built some friendships and we did move trust and tolerance toward people who met each other, but it didn't change people's attitudes toward Muslims, and it didn't change how people behaved around Muslims outside of the intervention. So in terms of mechanisms, so let's just focus on the treated group. How do we find these results? I don't find evidence for more information about Muslims. I don't find evidence of more empathy toward Muslims. Again, we're getting in like really small sample size territory, so I don't read too much into this. But I did find some qualitative evidence for changing norms around contact. So it was just totally taboo to even train with Muslims before the intervention. And afterwards, we saw players saying things like, now because of the league, it's the first time we practiced together. And, at baseline, only 2 of the 42 teams had ever trained with Muslims. And afterwards, that number shot up. So clearly that there's something happening about a changing norm. And the local residents, so you can see in the photo there, hundreds of people would come and watch the games. We also did a pre and post survey of the residents, and there's some observational evidence that they were also more supportive of intergroup activities, even outside of soccer, the more exposed they were to the leagues. And I also have some evidence for the importance of a positive experience. So basically success. So the more successful your team was, the larger the treatment effects you're able to unlock. So success itself doesn't really have an effect on tolerance. And being on a mixed team does not make you more successful, but being on a successful mixed team was the most powerful, with all the post-treatment bias that's potentially baked into that. So this still leaves us with an important puzzle, which is, why didn't these results actually extend off the field? So I don't know the answer, but some reasonable explanations are, first, that trusting strangers is just too much to ask of people after war. It's actually not really rational for people to do that. You're still dealing in an environment with really low rule of law. And, very recently it was life or death, who you decide to trust. And so it's just asking a bit too much for people to start trusting strangers. But once they can personally vet someone, there's no problem. It could be that these off the field behaviors are more costly. So they're physically, economically more costly. You have to drive to go somewhere else, outside of your social bubble. It's psychologically more taxing. It might be socially more costly, but that's exactly the point, right? Like trusting strangers is qualitatively more costly. It always will be more costly. And that is actually the thing we need to measure to see if we're able to move the needle at all. I think it also matters that, I focused on this Christian minority. Persecuted minorities in general have low levels of trust in the Middle East. It could be that for whatever reason, they didn't see their Muslim teammates as typical. So they weren't seen as representative of the outgroup as a whole, which is needed for that generalization to happen, although I didn't test that. But just to kind of take a step back, so to kind of illustrate what my preferred explanation, you can see this young man on the left who was holding a picture of one of his family members who disappeared in the fighting. And you see the same guy on the right with his Muslim teammates, just laughing and joking around, and they're friends. And that guy doesn't see any dissonance between those two things. Like you can personally get to know people and know that they're okay and you trust them, but you're not going to change how you feel in general about the outgroup in this setting where it's really dangerous to start trusting people. And so these grassroots interventions might need institutional change to really create lasting peace. In terms of the generalizability, so the treatment and the context in general had some particularities. I think it was important that the church and the religious leaders, who are also the political leaders in this setting, that they okayed the whole thing. So we're working on church fields. You can see the priests handing out awards. We had security forces who would show up to the games. So I think that was really important to let people know it was not stigmatized. It was also important that the Muslims had a decent skill level. So to Allport's original condition of cooperative contact, I would add, you need not just to cooperate, but the majority group needs to be willing to accept people, and the minority group needs to have the ability to actually cooperate. I also think it was important that this was totally non-political. It had a widespread appeal. People are not really into intergroup dialogue sessions in the Middle East. They don't really believe in them, those kinds of platitudes. So I think this was, it increased the recruitment potential, but on the downside, we didn't discuss any political realities or the roots of conflict. And so people's attitudes didn't change. And these kinds of conditions hold in other settings like classrooms, dorms, military training settings, and even some workplaces, which is where we're seeing the causal evidence based on contact emerge. So to wrap up, I've hopefully showed you some evidence that cooperative contact can actually build some very localized social cohesion after war, but transformative change is much harder, especially when distrust is actually pretty rational. And I don't mean from a statistical discrimination kind of distrust. I mean, the environment is still one of like relative lawlessness, or like at least a very weak rule of law. And so it's just a much higher ask of people. And if they actually get screwed, no one's really going to help. So the question is this kind of localized cohesion is working in these kinds of pockets? Is that enough? Are these communities now going to be more resilient when future shocks to tolerance happen? Are there some spillover effects? Are these effects durable enough? So is it actually worth just targeting this handful of communities because very few people are touched by these kinds of interventions? I don't know, but my hunch is that we probably need to actually address these things like structural protections for minorities in order to unlock this kind of durable change. And hopefully this also points to the importance of testing interdisciplinary strategies using RCTs and starting to move toward measuring real world behaviors instead of relying on self-reported outcomes. And maybe reviving this older literature about social capital and social trust and the potential for these cross-cutting civic organizations at scale, because the cross-cutting part has the element of intergroup contact. It could still be a promising avenue to build these kinds of pockets of localized cohesion. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing your thoughts and for the rest of the discussion.
Thank you so much, Salma. And there's been a few questions, in the chat, in the Q&A. I think what we're going to do is keep those for the last part of the webinar. Thank you so much. So I'd like to move now to the panel part, and maybe good order is to start with Betsy, because I think her work is in many ways kind of closest to kind of the particular kind of intervention that Salma has been testing. And then we'll go to Mario, that will give us kind of a sociologist perspective on the topic. And then we'll finish with Sandal, which, kind of is hard to define. But I would say that, kind of, I think one of the growing kind of discussion right now is about algorithm and whether we should view AI as a way to let's forget about trying to, solve and fix people biases and let's just avoid the humans. So more thoughts about the role of AI in this domain. So Betsy, do you want to start with your remark? Thank you so much. Thanks, Alma, again.
Great. Thanks, Salma, for that. That was fascinating as always. And I'm going to really briefly summarize a paper that I just put out with Roni Porat and Chelsea Clark and Don Green this year, which is a meta-analysis of prejudice reduction interventions. So evaluations of programs explicitly designed to reduce prejudice. I'm going to be really brief in my comments about it so that we can get right into the discussion. So let me just tell you what we found. So looking across all social and biomedical sciences, we're a part political science, part psychology team. We scanned the entire literature over the past dozen years because we had previously reviewed this literature in narrative form. And over the past dozen years, we were able to capture around 420 experiments. And what we find is, first of all, a trend in the literature where there's this big uptick in prejudice reduction research. And some of the research, which we highlight in the paper, is just phenomenal. It's, there's studies that are these landmark studies, as we describe them. Salma's is one of them. And it really sets the standard, not just for prejudice research, but for social science research. So there's great work out there, but unfortunately, the modal research is quite different from those outstanding examples. There are many reasons not to trust the majority of the research because of methodological problems. And so when we actually cut up the findings, we have an overall finding, an average effect of kind of a modest positive impact across every kind of interventions: diversity training, implicit bias training, educations, contacts, entertainment, and all different sorts of cognitive and emotional interventions. Once you cut that up, though, even if you do something really hands off the scale, let's look at the quality of the studies. You just cut it by quintile in terms of sample size. How many people are in the treatment group? What you find is the top quintile of this exercise is 78 people or more in the treatment group. So, I mean, this is just a huge red flag in terms of the quality of this literature. So that's one call. That's one way I would say that I'd love to see JPAL get more involved. We need to really focus on this literature. But the other thing that it does once you cut up the literature this way is we see the average effect size is tracking exactly the sample size, which is a really big indication of publication bias. So there's a lot of reasons not to really trust this overall positive effect. So if we just look at that top quintile, and now again, we did a lot of coding of these studies, but we're just going to hands off the scale say, let's say that the best studies are the ones with 78 or more people in the treatment sample. What we find is a pretty small positive average effect. So a D of 0.18, which if we were measuring you on a scale of 0 to 100, it would take you from the kind of a mild prejudice, say, of 40, it would take you to about a 44, say. That's just a little translation of that effect. So I think the way that we go with this, the impressions that I want to leave you with is, first of all, not just that the most rigorous research shows the smallest reductions, but also that this research from the past dozen years is of a particular type. So when we went in and we spent a lot of time with these studies, we qualitatively coded them. What we find is that most of them are very brief interventions. So we coded them as light touch interventions if they were taking either 15 minutes or less time, were cheap and easy to implement. So you had to meet all three of those conditions to be coded as light touch. And we find about 78% of all interventions over the past dozen years are light touch interventions, right? So these are not contact soccer leagues in Northern Iraq. The second thing that's really interesting, and I want to just say two more thoughts on, is that the majority could be characterized as mentalizing interventions. What do I mean by that? There are these interventions that are targeted at individuals and that are really trying to affect your mental life, the way that you think about other groups, the way that you control your emotions about other groups. They don't involve other people. They don't involve institutions, right? So these are very individualized interventions that are truly focused on your psychology. What are your attitudes? What are your emotions? What are your social categorizations? So the way that I would love to see this this research going, I think that since the preponderance of the evidence so far has been really individualized, focused on individual mental life, I'd love to see more evaluations of more structurally oriented interventions, which is very rare to see. And I want us to think about structure not in terms of just institutions and leaders and rules. These are sort of the official structures that change our collective experience, our incentives, punishments, et cetera. I'd like to also think about the unofficial structures that also change our collective experiences. So these more loose social gatherings and loose unofficial social organizations that also change the way we think about our world, about our reference groups, that change norms and unofficial social punishments. So those are some directions that I think would be really important for this literature. And I have some more thoughts, but I'll pass it on to my panelists now.
Thank you so much, Betsy. That was amazing. I think that makes, kind of Mario as the next kind of speaker very natural, given where Betsy concluded her remark. Mario, do you want to take it on? Do you want to take it up?
I'll try. I'm still thinking about what Betsy said. She's given me a lot to think about. And also Salma's really interesting presentation. So what I'm going to talk about in about 3 minutes is the paper I wrote with a colleague who's now gone, Deepa Pager, who spent a lot of her time studying discrimination. And I've spent a lot of my time studying institutions. And we ended up writing a paper for the Journal of Economic Perspectives on institutional discrimination. And part of what we argued is that while, as you mentioned earlier, Marianne, the taste-based discrimination model and the statistical-based discrimination model that are traditional economics are valuable, they're insufficient. And one way in which they're insufficient is that a lot of what people do is unconscious and reflects biases of the kinds that Betsy's work has tried to see whether it's possible to reduce. But what I like to focus on is a totally different understanding of discrimination in which organizations play a role. So what we call in this paper institutional discrimination is differential treatment that is either perpetrated by an organization or codified into law. And I'm using that term differential treatment in the passive sense on purpose, because the core point is that discrimination doesn't always result from the decisions of an individual today deciding to act against somebody else. And so, and the reason this matters is because it gets us from the point of understanding I like the term mentalizing, sort of attitudes in your head to behavior in the real world to actual outcomes. And so I'll just give you an example. So in the work, Deepa and I were both deeply interested in inequality. And so we were concerned with things like, for example, who gets a job? You can imagine a whole bunch of literature that actually some people on this panel know a lot about, in which try to understand the extent to which employers in their head are discriminating on the basis of race, indicators of race, like the name of the applicant and so on. That's important. But it is possible for an employer to be completely de-biased and still be part of an organization that discriminates as a result of the institutional practices in the organization. I'll give you a simple example. Many institutions, many organizations hire on the basis of referrals, meaning employees get a bonus if they refer somebody. The organization gives additional points because they're more predictable and so on to candidates who come in referred from somebody else. imagine an organization that's racially homogeneous having this practice. We know for a fact that friendship networks tend to be racially homogeneous, so people tend to have friends of their own race. If this organization strongly institutes referral-based hiring, what is essentially going to happen is it is continuously going to reproduce essentially its same racial composition, such that candidates who are not of that racial group are going to have a lower probability of getting a job, even though nobody's personally racist, nobody's statistically discriminating, nobody's making a rational guess, nobody has any animosity, simply as a function of the institutional practice of the organization. I'll give you another example that's very common, in which, again, it doesn't actually matter who the person is making the decision as an employer, as a hiring manager, or whatever it is. Many organizations hire on the basis of institutional affiliations. So, you know, they'll go to Georgetown, they'll go to Princeton, they'll go to the University of Chicago and do recruitment season for all of their positions in the spring. You've all been familiar with this. To the extent that, and we know this, that managers have a bias towards recruiting from their organizations, what you're gonna have is they're gonna keep reproducing employees who look just like them and who look like the racial composition of those institutions. There's gonna be a small amount of diversity, but very little. And again, you know, the candidates who went to, you know, Morehouse College, the brilliant statistician at Spelman College, right, at the historically Black colleges, historically Latino institutions that aren't part of that recruiting network simply won't have the same probability of getting in. So the point I'll leave us with is what I'd love to see is interventions that are looking at organizational level interventions that do not depend on people changing their minds or debiasing themselves, even though I think that is an important thing we ought to be doing anyway. But based on the research that Betsy just very rightly pointed to, that do not necessarily depend on individuals, but take into account the organizations that actually play a role in these decisions. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Mario. Sandal, do you wanna go next?
Thanks, Marianne. Let me just start. It's going to feel like I'm doing a big gear shift, but I'll try to connect back to what everyone is saying. Let me try and articulate that I think if we're looking at this issue over the next 10 years, much less 50 years, we simply can't ignore the role that algorithms play. And let me give an example. We want to talk about intergroup contact. Even already in 2021, Facebook's newsfeed algorithm plays a bigger role in intergroup contact than any intervention that we could devise or scale. That is, who we interact with is dictated by a set of algorithms on social media, and that's in 2021 and is going to increase dramatically. If you want to talk about institutions, a big, huge new kind of institution that now exists pretty much everywhere, and we're only starting the expansion of algorithms, is algorithms. So to illustrate, if you think about institutions of hiring, and as Mario put, like referral practices, a massive change in institutions in hiring is algorithms that do resume screening and sorting, et cetera. And again, we are literally at the tip of the spread of these. Now, why should we think about these objects? Well, they're objects that have their own unique logic. We shouldn't think of them just as we would institutions in the traditional sense. For example, one big negative about them is that they are opaque. We know the rules we put in practice. We don't really understand what the algorithms we put out there are doing. We know the spec that went into building them, but what are they actually doing? So opacity is a huge problem. But in contrast, they have a feature that most institutions don't have. They're entirely reprogrammable. You can literally pull out the newsfeed algorithm at Facebook and put another one in. Like, it's very rare that we have a policy levers that are that drastic that we can just take out huge parts of an institution, pop it in, and overnight get a different effect. So what have we learned in these early days about algorithms? So the first thing I think we've learned is that algorithms come with their own biases, or at least that's what the literature would tell you. I'll give some examples. One, a popular example that made its rounds on news media. Amazon. Sorry, I don't know. Hear me? Something changed. Okay, Amazon had put in a so goes the story, had put in an algorithm to help screen resumes, and a team inside of it had found that the algorithm was biased against female resumes, and so they pulled the plug and so on. And it was a near disaster. If they hadn't noticed it, it would have been this automated, institutionalized discrimination just deep inside the code of what resumes get seen. Something we'd done that I don't know how true that story is, but that is the story making the rounds. Something we did that was a more careful thing with Ziad Obermeyer and a set of colleagues was looking at an algorithm that was dictating the healthcare of about 100 million people in the United States. It was an algorithm that dictated, based on your past characteristics, whether you would get additional resources and you needed extra care. And what we found was that this algorithm, conditional on the risk score that it put out, Black patients were significantly sicker than white patients. So it was supposed to be giving help to those who need it the most, but so much so that it was so biased that had we gotten rid of the discrimination, you would double the number of African Americans enrolled in this program. Now, what's striking about this is literally at scale. 80 million people, probably more, were already being affected for the last 3-4 years, and no one knew about it. And now there's this mad rush in healthcare to fix this bug in this code, and we can talk about what caused it. So that's point one. Algorithms can have their own biases. And the frightening thing about these biases is, despite their reprogrammability, they're also, because they're scalable, they can spread very quickly and affect large populations like overnight. There were no care coordination program algorithms 6 years ago. Now there were for 80 million people, and boom, there you are. You have this bias baked in. But there's a second part to this story. To view this whole narrative as if algorithms have their biases is entirely, I think, dangerous and fallacious. In fact, I think it is probably the most pernicious thing that's happened in this literature, because it has taken the focus away from root problems and put it on this object and externalize it to the algorithm. Let's go back to this possibly fictitious Amazon story. Let me retell the story for you in a way that should make you super annoyed. Amazon built an algorithm to screen resumes. They discovered it was gender biased. They threw it away. Good story. Bad story. Amazon built an algorithm to screen resumes by training it on the data of how they tended to pick resumes in the past. The algorithm said, hey, I'm not picking female resumes because you don't pick female resumes. The Geiger counter detected radiation. We threw away the Geiger counter and said, oh, well, that algorithm's clearly broken. Let's go back to the way things were. This is insane. Algorithms have biases because we have biases. And when they reveal something, simply throwing away the algorithm is the worst possible outcome. I mean, sorry, the worst possible outcome might have been keeping the algorithm, I suppose, but at some level, this is pretty close to second bad. Let me conclude on something quite optimistic, which is, on the other hand, I think that besides being mirrors for our own biases, algorithms could serve as an intervention that can help us fix biases. Some work that Emma Pearson and Ziad and others, and I was a little involved, had done is in the world of pain and healthcare. For those of you who don't know, that the poor experience a lot more pain than the rich, pretty much all sorts of pain. And one reason for this, of course, is they might have worse knee injuries or other injuries. So what the literature has done is, suppose I took x-rays, suppose I got people to look at how bad the x-rays were, and then asked, is there a gap? There's still a very huge gap amongst the disadvantaged and Black patients. So even conditional on the severity of the x-ray, there is a big gap. What we did is we asked, well, maybe there isn't a gap. Maybe the problem is in the human judgment of what makes a severe knee problem. I mean, it's just medical knowledge. How do we know we've discovered everything? So when you point an algorithm to predict knee pain directly from the x-ray, leave out the middleman, middlewoman of the doctor, what you actually find is the algorithm discovers new features of x-rays that have been emitted that seem to cause pain. And those new features are disproportionately located in the poor and Black patients. Now, why is that? Well, where does medical knowledge come from? From people looking at x-rays, making their own guesses as to what the sources are. Whose x-rays did they look at? Well, the original studies that decided what matters in knee x-rays, it's not just that they didn't have many Black or poor patients. If you go and look up those studies and look for tables that ask, okay, what is their race composition? They don't list it because it was from 1950 England and it never even occurred to them that there's such a thing as race. What do you mean race composition? And this is the statistical breakdown in the paper. So this is by way of saying, in that case, the algorithm actually serve the role to discover things, and then we might even be able to automate fixes. So I'll just end on that and say, I think there are some real possibilities here for doing good in this space.
Thank you all so much. It sounds like Marianne Bertrand is having a bit of a technical difficulty, so while we wait for her to reconnect, I wanted to bump a couple of the questions from the chat. So one of the questions I think is really interesting is from Catherine Mohan. So she was asking about the role of gender in discrimination and bias, and not, and in her words, she doesn't mean the discrimination based on gender, but rather the role that gender plays in terms of how receptive or resistant people may be to anti-bias interventions. And for me personally, I would also be curious, not just gender, but other characteristics as well. I know Betsy, you as well as Mario touched on this, and I'd also be curious, Salma, from your work, and Sendil as well, if you have any insights on this. But first, maybe I can turn it over to Betsy to go first.
Sure. So I think that one of the problems of reviewing the literature and then sort of kicking the legs out from under it by making you distrust it is that you shouldn't trust my answer on this. In fact, I'm telling you, you shouldn't trust the literature's response to this. But let me tell you something that might confirm some intuitions, or might flow with some intuitions you have. There's only 2 large RCTs of diversity trainings in the past dozen years. So 2 field experiments of diversity trainings. And one of them was done by Edward Chung with a bunch of co-authors, and studied an online diversity training with a global corporation. So actually had enough power to look at heterogeneous effects. And indeed, they find that all positive effects of this online diversity training were concentrated among employees of color and women. So any average positive effect they have means that those were the people who went through the training and then signed up to do mentoring of underrepresented employees and women afterwards. Was the very same population. So the problem is that we don't actually have enough studies that gather enough data to look at heterogeneous effects, but there is some evidence out there that might suggest this differential impact.
Seems like something ripe for additional study. Mario, I saw you unmuted yourself. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I concur fully. The only thing I would add is that there have been studies that have looked at, so one easier way of looking at heterogeneity is by non-RCTs. And I know that JPOL is there's a mission, but it would behoove me to say that there are things you can learn from non-experimental studies. And especially when you can use both the power of experimental studies to isolate a causal effect in a particular context, and the power of large-scale non-experimental studies to look at an entire industry, you can actually gain a lot of traction. There are some large-scale, Alexander Kalev and Frank Dobbin have done some large-scale studies of, I think, nearly 1,000 organizations over time, over multiple years, and looked at the impact of diversity training. And their basic conclusion is actually quite consistent, which I love. By and large, they don't have a very strong impact. I mean, they would just say they don't work. I think that's not too unfair characterization of the discipline. They end up focusing on or suggesting that there are things that our institutions can do that can work, and we can talk about whether those are tested. But just to second the point that we need more work in this area, and to add that some of that work can actually also be non-experimental and still be useful.
There's also a couple of studies that focus specifically on minority students. So minority being like coming from the disadvantaged group from a power perspective. I think there was one done in Israel, Palestine, and other in the US, usually among children. They are RCTs. I think this is Linda Trop and some of her colleagues. And like what they find is that, if I remember correctly, the effect sizes are like just much smaller among like minority group members of when you look at contact. And one study that did actually had just like regular contact in a classroom, and then they added another arm that was like actually addressing like the root, discussing the power imbalance, and doing that, if I remember, boosted the effects among minority students. So there's something about like, if people are in already a low power status position, just like putting them in a room with other people they're gonna not really change their minds. They're gonna stay as skeptical. But if they feel heard and that they're actually able to talk about the power imbalances, that helps, if I'm remembering the study correctly. But yeah, so I think this is Chelsea and Betsy also brought up a really interesting point in one of their papers, just talking about the ethics of this as well, of kind of using minority individuals, like their bodies are literally the treatment. Like you kind of put them in a room and like they are the treatment. So I just want to raise that point. It's like they have to behave like nearly perfectly as well for all these things to go well. And so it's just another dimension of this, like looking at subgroup effects by minorities and whether you expect things to play out in the same way. And I think that's another important dimension to mention. Like it's kind of different when you yourself are the treatment most of the time.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So sorry, my computer died and I've been struggling to get back on this webinar. So sorry about that. And I may have missed, part of the conversation. I had a question, for Mario. Certainly kind of the whole topic of like institution-based, discrimination as, kind of taken over. And I think more and more people are talking about it. Great. I struggle as to thinking about how we can, could do RCT, could do field experiments, to tackle a particular area. And I'd love to hear your thought, Mario, but, Betsy and Sandra, if you have any as to what would be approaches to questions, with the methods that JPAL has, if any.
Yeah, so one thing I would think of is to do studies to take up the thing we were just talking about, where you manipulate the kind of training and you think at the organizational level. So, the underlying a lot of our conversation so far about diversity training and all of this is that there's a lot of very different things that you could call diversity training. And in other words, all of these studies are not necessarily all assessing the same treatment. And so one of the things that I actually have found useful in the work of Alexandra Kalev is that they've looked a little bit, again, this is not in an RCT context, but in a survey-based context, but at the organizational level, at which kinds of diversity training, quote unquote, have seemed to work. And they found a lot of impact for volunteer rather than mandatory, and team-based rather than individual-based training. So rather than the training where you go online, for example, or strategies, rather than going online, for example, and you go through a course over 40 minutes or whatever, where it doesn't let you move forward unless you click on the right things, and there's a little quiz at the end, and then you got a certification that you did it. Creating task force with some agency to decide, okay, we have this problem at the organizational level. How do you think we should address it? And I can imagine a scenario where you have enough organizations interested in this, which is the state we are in today. Post George Floyd, everybody cares about this. Where you find enough organizations that with a small tweaks at the organizational level, you can design essentially a large organizational level RCT. That's kind of the first set of things that come to mind, tweaking what you do at the diversity training level. There are other things that you can do, again, based on sort of the kind of work that we've had so far. You'd have to find employers willing to do this, but almost all employers have their kind of biases for the kinds of institutions that they go to, whether it's banking companies and they want to go to Harvard and Princeton and Chicago rather than Howard. They haven't thought about going to Howard and Spelman and Morehouse. These are historically Black institutions, the last three. So you can imagine a different kind of intervention where you can do some subset of employees for a year or 2 years, just at least try fielding candidates from different kind of institutions and seeing what happens. Again, I'm just literally thinking out loud in response to you, but to me, it actually doesn't seem untractable at all. To me, I think we already have the tools for doing this at a pretty large scale.
Thanks, Mario. Betsy, does what Mario just talk about overlaps with, I took your intervention as being, most of the work that's been going on there is fairly light touch, very individual based. We need more, structurally oriented type work. What do you have in mind there? Is it mainly what Mario is talking about, or do you have other things in mind that you think we should try to evaluate?
Yeah, I think I have two prongs in mind. One is that I don't want anyone to look at this meta-analysis we've done and think that an absence of evidence is evidence of absence, right? So just like Mario said, there are lots of different kinds of diversity trainings out there. And so, I think that one role that JPAL and others interested in, really building a solid base of causal evidence on interventions would think about is that, we should find out whether it works. Diversity training could become one of these zombie ideas that's bolstered by, legal necessity that everybody does. And so it's going to take some really, really good evidence to kill it, and if we need to kill it, we should probably go after it, or a particular kind of diversity training that, we think is harmful or useless and sucks up resources and gets people off the hook. So I think that's one idea, is like go after these ideas that have such sway over, corporate America and the government, et cetera. I think the other thing, though, is that I think that JPAL could think about leading the way in evaluations of structural change, like I was saying, and it presents this host of methodological problems. The kinds of institutional change, the kinds of structural change that activists are calling for, that a lot of practitioners believe is needed, are harder to evaluate with RCTs. And I think it calls for a lot of creative thinking and collaborative effort that I think would be really interesting and worthwhile. And I think that one of the things that is needed is a lot more research on implementation. And so studies that involve qualitative evidence on, how these things go over, even when you have these small sample experiments, maybe there are certain experimental templates that we could use going forward to build evidence over time. But we don't know a lot about what causes backlash in the implementation of certain kinds of new hiring structures, even in terms of introducing a new algorithm into an institution. So how do you build the kind of climate in an institution that would allow for these kinds of big moves? So I think that, we could think about experimental research as kind of R&D research for that. But I also think that we should be really open to process research and building up capacity for really understanding what the implementation of big change looks like. And so those are the two ways that I'm interested in moving forward out of this literature.
That's awesome. Thanks, Betsy. Sandor, and again, I heard only part of your remarks, so you may have talked about this already, but in the domain of AI and algorithm, kind of where are places for, for field experiments? What are kind of low-hanging fruits to try to move the conversation forward and the evidence field forward?
That one is, thanks, Marianne. I think that one is by far the sort of easiest, just because unlike the much harder problems, these algorithms really are quite decomposable. They do have the ability to take them in, take them out. So I think that we're probably at the right stage to ask the question. And the reason I think we're at the right stage is a lot of the algorithmic bias research right now doesn't engage with the counterfactual question. That is, it is about the algorithm, not about the algorithm versus what. Algorithm versus another algorithm, the algorithm versus the default current situation of human decision making. Yeah. So simply the injection of counterfactual thinking. Okay, we want to talk about this algorithm. I want to talk about its problems relative to what? I think it sounds so silly to say it, but I think that simple tenet of experimental thinking, forcing you to define the control and the treatment arms, would be super valuable just to start with, and I think would be very eye-opening. And then once you've done that, I think there are just an endless number of domains where there are experiments are possible. I mean, they already happen for other things. There's a constant experimentation of algorithms to figure out which one is better at getting you to click on which ad. So, I mean, if we can put energy into that fairly pointless activity, we could put energy into the online equivalent of Salma and Betsy's question around, do algorithms that promote intergroup interactions in meaningful ways have any sort of effects that are noticeable in behavior, like soccer leagues over time? Or, I mean, so I think there are many, many places where you can do it. I think the first starting point is just this counterfactual thinking, which is super valuable.
But how, I mean, kind of, again, just sticking with like context, I mean, we don't really control, the key partners that would need to be controlled to try to experiment with different kind of algorithms, for example, on Facebook or social media, right? So I think a lot of these kind of questions seem to, require some partners. Am I thinking about this the wrong way?
No, I think they do require partners. And I think you're 100% right, Marianne. But I also am not so pessimistic. That is, I think it's reasonably pessimistic that if you decide you must run an experiment with Facebook, okay, that's going to be hard. But if you say, I'm interested in scouring all the kinds of different firms out there that do lots of different things, that have lots of different algorithms, and I'm going to explore them, I think there's plenty of opportunities. So for example, in healthcare, because of the study we did, there are plenty of health systems who have come and work with us now to fix their algorithms. I'm sure some of them would be very eager to say, well, could we currently have algorithms that match patients to doctors. Could we try things there that don't just look at patient? But so I just think as long as one opens, I think as long as you open the aperture to just being a bit more adventurous and contacting a lot of different companies, I think that things will work out. Maybe I'm too naive, but I'm a little optimistic.
If I can actually build on that, I think that's a great point. And I would just add that we don't actually always have to depend on companies. So Damon Centola, in the context of healthcare, for example, has just created platforms for people interested in health and improving their health or losing weight, and run quite a few experiments, pretty impactful experiments on the impact of networks, and basically manipulating the algorithm that assigns to a network. Matt Salganik and Duncan Watts some years ago did something similar in the context of, it was not about discrimination, it was about culture and health. But again, just as we can create experiments of the kind Betsy did in a whole bunch of high schools with a big impact, we'd actually do the same thing on the platform level. It's quite easy in this day and age. And the number of people who are willing to download an app and participate in a study is actually big. So I completely agree with Sandro. There's a ton of companies. There's also a ton of other ways, even if we don't want to go to companies, in which actually we can do this.
Great. Isa, I'm not seeing the Q&A.
Marianne, Betsy has a...
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Betsy.
Can I actually ask a question that I'm dying to ask the group that might take us in a slightly different direction?
Go ahead.
I feel like this is a gross oversimplification, but I feel like one maybe divide here on the panel that I would just love to hear you all talk about is this idea, maybe, it's one that came up in the discussion of the literature on defaults, right? So it's this question of whether to change the institution or the algorithm versus the person, which is, an oversimplification. But if we were to bet on one versus the other, right? The concern that I always get from psychologists is kind of, like the climate control concern, right? So I could just put your house on climate control and you could be a great energy saving person, right? Your house just automatically adjusts the temperature, but I haven't changed anything about your attitudes toward the climate. And so if you moved into a new house without this climate control, would you just leave the heat on all the time, right? And be an offender. So that's the worry that a lot of people in my field have about, just hitting institutions, and they wonder, do we have enough evidence that once you change institutions and change these rules, does it change the people? And so I'm just wondering how everybody's thinking about that, or how you would respond, because it's a concern that I have going forward.
Can I double down on that concern, which is, I think my one fear with the sort of RCT methodology in this area is that I think it's not being applied very, no one's making a mistake, but the institutional infrastructure is not set up in a way that currently allows us to be thoughtful about it. So let me give an analogy with drug trials. So if you're interested in an intermediate outcome like blood pressure, you can run very different RCTs than if you decide your outcome of interest is mortality. In fact, many drugs that move blood pressure don't see any effect on mortality. That's almost obvious to say. But if I think of your question, Betsy, one of the challenges is that it's almost, you know the evidence better than I would, but it seems to me almost obvious that there's a cumulative dose response effect of anything of any behavior change in these issues. So if I take the soccer leagues, I love your generalization point, Selma. It's like, this person I now feel better about, but there's no detectable generalized effect for everybody. But suppose there's a 1% effect for everybody. Well, since there are 100 everybody's, that's as big as this one, and you never detect it. So the effect might be twice as big. Suppose it was a 2% effect. Now it's twice as big. But the diffusion of detectability of the broader aggregate institutional change means that if we're not ultra careful, trials inherently bias us towards the kind of interventions we consider. It's just natural, no matter how careful we are. And so I think that we have to also, just to double down on your point, Betsy, if we're going to be meaningfully thinking about these effects, the long, like, you know, everyone's seen the graph about in the US preferences for interracial marriage, how it went from like people being totally against it in a very short amount of time, falling off a cliff, to people being totally for it. That, it'd be hard to say there was an intervention that caused that cliff. It was the accumulated effect of the interventions up to that point. So I just think that if we're going to think about, you know, persons versus institutions, we have a built-in bias in RCTs and in empirical work the way we currently do it.
That's a fantastic point, and I think it also raises to me one of the other difficulties of RCTs is that they are much better able at, you know, targeting the person, you know, kind of. I think there's a reason as to why, you know, kind of a great share of the evidence that Betsy reviewed in our meta-analysis was mentalizing and individual interventions. But, you know, I think Mario made me more optimistic that, you know, kind of there are also ways to leverage RCTs to think about, you know, kind of the institution or broader system. I think we have just 5 minutes left, and I'm not seeing the Q&A, but I have just at least one more question. I mean, this conversation is fantastic. How do we move forward? I don't know how frequently, you know, Sandor and Mario and Betsy have the chance to talk to each other, but certainly I think we're learning from this that there's a lot to gain from, you know, kind of people across the disciplines talking to each other. So how can we move this forward? What kind of structure could, you know, for example, JPAL, you know, try to help to put together to really try to, you know, kind of bring forward a research agenda that would be cross-disciplinary to make progress on these questions? You know, any thought? What's needed? What's infrastructure that's needed?
I mean, sorry, go ahead, Mario. Just a one sentence response. I think some kind of meta on contact is really desperately needed. Like, there needs to be a coordinated effort of harmonizing outcomes, like survey-based and behavioral, running them in all sorts of different places that run the gamut in terms of like the outcome of interest. So, you know, basically prejudice or intergroup relations, and then trying to tie them to this higher, as Sandil was saying, like, okay, well, let's say we change prejudice, but have we changed something? What is the ultimate goal? Is individual prejudice just the intermediary step to the ultimate goal, which is, for example, like lower hate crimes or like higher, you know, school enrollment rates, or like what is the ultimate outcome? So some kind of coordinated effort across studies, and that needs like really good institutional partnerships, honestly, for it to happen at a scale that's even worthwhile. And then trying to link it to the ultimate outcome of interest, which I don't think is necessarily individual prejudice. I think it's something bigger.
Thanks, Alma. Mario?
Yeah, I would actually add to Betsy's earlier point about the qualitative work. So her point, as I took it, was that a lot of what we need is process studies, so infrastructure for taking process studies seriously in the context of RCTs. And I think that's one wing. And I think the other wing I would add is something that's both scale and portability studies. So a beautiful RCTs in particular context without a clear idea how they might work elsewhere is not necessarily a great thing to do, particularly when you're thinking about institutions. Institutions are very locally specific. Something that worked beautifully in Iraq might work terribly in Iran or whatever. So I think sort of building both of those sides, in a sense, the very micro process qualitative work and the very macro sort of scalability, meaning how to go bigger, and also portability, meaning how it might work in very different kinds of contexts, which requires other kinds of methods like surveys and so on, I think would be helpful as well. Building it as an institutional feature rather than something for other people who are not doing experiments to do.
That makes sense. Sandor?
Let me add, I think it's already implicit in our conversation, so let me bring it out more explicitly. if I think of what is the value add as opposed to what is good research that could be done, that is, what could JPAL do that's meaningfully delta in addition? I think there's actually one structure that's been in our conversation that would work, I think, excellently. It's clear that the public good is finding organizations that are willing to experiment / do research, qualitative, quantitative. So that's a public good, and JPAL has the convening power to get that together. On the other side, to go back to some of the earlier concerns that came up, one could say, okay, amongst all the possible opportunities, how do we sift? That seems to me the place to have a good interdisciplinary sort of group of advisors, et cetera, to then either help people formulate and or sift between the opportunities after the fact so that we're making meaningful choices. So I guess I would say use the convening power of JPAL to get a bunch of organizations on board. So that's what young researchers really need. They don't have the ability to go out and get that. Conditional on them having being on board and getting ideas, et cetera, through the mix, have an interdisciplinary group of people who can help find the right, just guide us to making sure we're making at least halfway reasonable choices.
That makes sense. That makes sense. I believe, Isa, correct me if I'm wrong, that we are about out of time. Is that correct?
We have 1 minute, yes.
And I'm going to take this 1 minute to conclude. And first, again, I want to thank Salma, Betsy, Mario, and Sandor for taking the time out of their, I'm sure, very, very busy schedule to do this with us. I apologize again for my computer crashing down at really the worst time it could have. And I'm, kind of energized by this conversation. I really, believe that this is an area where, we have the ability to make progress. And I very much hope that this webinar will be the first of many that will, organized via JPAL to really try to get something going, a truly kind of cross-disciplinary research agenda that, will inform policy. So with this, thank you so much for everybody else for joining us, and thank you all for coming.